Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to have so many of you joining us today. That's really wonderful to see. I'm Mary Elizabeth Fukai, and I'm filling in for Brittany Branyan, who is the Carey Center Director for Collegiate and Community Programs, and she's currently out on maternity leave. And I'm so thrilled to have this opportunity to fill in for her today. Welcome to the Carey Center Nonprofit Affiliate Program's virtual presentation on Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving. If you're unfamiliar with the Carey Center Nonprofit Affiliate Program at Auburn University, we foster a community of educators, professionals, organizations, and students who have a desire to embody philanthropy, nonprofit studies, and leadership in their professional and personal lives. We do this in part by providing professional development and networking opportunities, as well as educational programs like this one, to our members and the community at large. During today's program, we're going to learn about African American women's history of charitable giving, activism, education, and social service provision through the life and example of Madam C.J. Walker, who's the early 20th century Black entrepreneur. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Tyrone Freeman. Dr. Freeman is an award-winning writer, speaker, and teacher whose work examines the intersections of philanthropy, activism, and race in America. As a nationally recognized expert in African American philanthropy, he writes and speaks about various forms of Black generosity and social change, past and present. His work has appeared or been cited in Time, the Oprah Magazine, Newsweek, News One, the Chicago Tribune, The Conversation, Black Perspectives, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and the Stanford Social Innovations Review, among others. Currently, he is an assistant professor of philanthropic studies at Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. Dr. Freeman, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Elizabeth, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm very excited to be here with you, grateful for the invitation, and so glad you have chosen to tune in today and hang around with us for a little bit. I want to start by just giving thanks to my dear brother, Peter Weber, Dr. Peter Weber, for making this invitation, making it happen. We were in our doctoral program together, so I'm so proud of you and all that you are accomplishing on behalf of the Carey community there. And so thank you again for the opportunity. As was said, I'm here to share with you some ideas from my book, Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving, Black Women's Philanthropy. It just came out this past fall. I'm very excited about it. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you. So I'm going to share my screen and then we will get things started here. And so everybody should be seeing this now. And so I want to start by just giving you a little bit of background about why I wrote this book. And the first, I want to start with my family. I'm the son, grandson, nephew, and cousin of African-American Baptist preachers and first ladies. And everybody else who wasn't in the pulpit was a trustee or a deacon or a Sunday school. I'm sure that sounds familiar to many of you, right? But it was a very generous community that people were giving and engaging in so many different ways of their time, of their money, of their words to encourage each other, service, ushering. But you know what? They never used the word philanthropy. To them, they were just doing what you were supposed to do, doing the Lord's will, but it wasn't something that you would label separately. And yet, years later, when I entered into the professional world of fundraising, I found myself really confused why this professional space didn't really understand or appreciate this tradition of African-American giving and generosity. And so years later, when I entered into the academy and began working on my PhD, and which is in philanthropic studies, and I began to read all the theories and the literature and the so-called canon, and even still saw that there was a struggle to deal with this simple idea that Black people give too. And so I wrote this book to fill this gap between my lived experience of having grown up in this tradition and in this culture of generosity and giving by and among African Americans, and these professional spaces of philanthropy that didn't seem to understand it or don't get it. And this is a picture of me in regalia standing with Madam Walker's great-great-granddaughter, Lilly Bundles, who's a biographer of Madam Walker as well. And so Madam C.J. Walker's Gospel of Giving is my articulation of her philosophy of philanthropy. That is why she gave, what she gave, how she gave, but more importantly, perhaps, the context in which she gave. And what do I mean by that? To lay out this context, I'm going to need a little help from W.E.B. Du Bois. You all will know that Du Bois is one of the eminent scholars that America has produced, the first Black man to graduate from Harvard with a PhD in 1895. But I want to point out something to you that he said in 1909. He wrote this: "Few races are more instinctively philanthropic than the Negro. It is shown in everyday life and in their group history. Some few of their larger philanthropies in America in early days have been recorded." In 1909, he's writing this. And somehow the way we tell the history of philanthropy and the way we think about it, 1909, Black people and philanthropy do not go together. But here is America's most eminent scientist of this era telling us that yes, it does. And in fact, where does this come from? Get this. It comes from a national study on Black philanthropy that he conducted in 1909. Yes, my friends, Black philanthropy was enough of a thing then at the height of Jim Crow for him to do a national study. And it's important to think about this context because we're 4 decades removed from emancipation from slavery, where 4 million newly free people entered into what was supposed to be a free society. We're 3 decades removed from the promise of Reconstruction, which was extended to African Americans. They began to taste freedom, began to taste citizenship, and then literally an angry white South rose up and took those rights away and left Jim Crow in its wake. We also are a decade away from the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision, which codified Jim Crow as the law of the land. And it is in this context that he writes, "Few races are more instinctively philanthropic than the Negro." So it's important to understand this. There's this deep history of generosity, and it was active then, it's active now, and I want to make those connections because this is also the connection for and the context for Madam C.J. Walker's story. But it begins with Sarah Breedlove, her birth name. She was born on a cotton plantation in 1867 in Delta, Louisiana, the first freeborn person in her family. Her 4 brothers and sisters and her parents had all been enslaved, but she was the first born free. But life quickly turned tragic. By the age of 7, her parents had died. She began working as a washerwoman in her very early teens. She marries in her early teens. She has a daughter in the mid-teens. Tragedy strikes again. Her husband dies. She is doing this in this larger context now as a single mother. She's uneducated because there's no Jim Crow provisions for Black education in her community. And she's kind of this homeless migrant. She moves from Delta, Louisiana to Vicksburg, Mississippi, seeking better opportunity, which was just across the river, right? But seeking a sense of opportunity in this changing America where Jim Crow is being set up all around her. And of course, she's a Black woman in this context, where she's subject to all the forms of racial terror that are going on at the time. And all of these things happened to her before she turned 22. So it's very devastatingly difficult life for young Sarah. And yet the story changes. And unfortunately, I don't have time to get too much into it. It's in the book, but just to kind of lay out some parameters, she moves to St. Louis, where she begins to reconstruct her life with the help of a philanthropic social safety net created by the local Black community, anchored in a church, connected to schools and orphanages, founded and funded by Black people, that allowed her to begin to get legs underneath herself and begin to think about a different kind of life for herself. She enters into the beauty culture profession through another Black woman named Annie Malone, who had a company called the Poro Company, began selling for Annie Malone, and eventually developed her own products, where she put her face and name, Madam C.J. Walker. She married a man named Charles Joseph Walker, put her name and face on the product, which was revolutionary for the time. This is around 1905, and begins to sell them door to door. She moves to Indianapolis in 1910. She formally incorporates the business. She builds the first factory. And this is where she begins to become a household name and develops what becomes a $1 million business. Her story culminates in 1919 in this $250,000 mansion with 34 rooms in Irvington on Hudson, New York, where a nearby neighbor is Mr. John D. Rockefeller. That, my friends, is not supposed to happen in Jim Crow. That's not Jim Crow's plan for Black life. It's a plan that's focused on suffering and struggling, not this type of success. And one of the things that really grabbed me is that her generosity, her philanthropy did not begin in this fancy house at the end of her life. It is actually a thread across her lifetime that began when she was a poor, orphan, struggling single mother in St. Louis. And that's the story I want to share with you today. And so I began to do the research. In Indianapolis, we hold her papers at the Indiana Historical Society, 200 boxes of documents, incredible collection. Now they're all digitized. When I started this work, they weren't. So I had to go through by hand. But you can go log in and look at the same letters I looked at right now. And so as I was reading these archives, I needed a literature and a lens through which to read it. And so I began to connect with other literatures on the history of philanthropy. First, I went to the literature on American philanthropy, looking for Madam Walker. And guess what, my friends? She's not there. This literature and these scholars have focused on the elite, wealthy white men of the era who built companies that created untold fortunes the world had never seen before. And then they set up foundations which changed the landscape of philanthropy in America, like Carnegie, like Rockefeller. So this literature wasn't really helpful. It wasn't explaining what I was seeing in Madam Walker's documents. So then I said, well, if American philanthropy hasn't examined Madam Walker, then surely the historians of women's philanthropy have. But guess what, my friends? She's not there. This literature focuses on the wives, daughters, and sisters of the elite, wealthy white men who set up companies and built untold wealth the world had never seen before and set up foundations. So this was no help. So I said, well, surely if these two fields haven't looked at her, then African American philanthropy will have. It's a small literature, only a few things have been written about it, but surely she's got to be there. Guess what, my friends? She's not. This literature focuses on the collective rather than the individual. So there's a lot about the institutions of philanthropy among African Americans, like the church, like fraternities and sororities, but doesn't really raise up individuals. But it began to point me in the right direction because it was helping to make sense of this network that helped to rescue Sarah when she arrived in St. Louis. But then when I got to Black women's history, and looked at this incredible historiography that Black women's historians have been building out for the past half century. Madam Walker's world opened up. They had written about her. They had written about some of the things that she was experiencing and the context that she would have lived. And so then I began to be able to construct lenses cutting across these disciplines to examine and rethink philanthropy. And so these hashtags Cite a Sister, Cite Black Women are ways of lifting up the voices of Black women scholars whom I'm eternally grateful for, because without their work, I would not be able to do this work. And so there was a point in the archive that really began to crystallize the gospel of giving for me. And it happened in 1914. There's a series of letters between Madam Walker and Booker T. Washington, who you recall from history is the leading, the Black political leader of the era. He's controversial. Not every African American agrees with him, but he has the ears of the white political elite and the pockets of the white philanthropic elite. And she is talking to Booker T. Washington about supporting his school, Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It still exists to this day, Tuskegee University. And she wants to give him $300 to support, get this, 5 students, and there still would be $50 left over for the general fund. That doesn't happen anymore today, my friends, right? But she wants to really support these students because she believes in what he's doing, even though he's this controversial leader. And so they go back and forth about this gift. And then Washington does something. He challenges her to give more. Now, those of us in fundraising would just call that the simple upgrade. It's pretty standard procedure. We do it all the time. But Madam Walker was not having it. She was upset. She took offense that he was not accepting the gift as she wasn't offering it. So she sat down and wrote a letter in which she proceeded to tell him about himself. She was not happy at all. And so she just said, I'm just very confused. We talked about $300. You said this would be helpful. You said it was fine. Now you're turning on me. What's going on here? My company is successful. I want to give you thousands of dollars, but right now I can only give you hundreds. Work with me here. And then she hits him with this. She says, quote, I am unlike your white friends who have waited until they were rich and then help, but have in proportion to my success, I have reached out and am helping others. When I saw this, I began to smile from ear to ear. She was telling me her philosophy of philanthropy, and she was making a clear distinction. Who were Washington's white friends? Well, let's take a look. For starters, there's Andrew Carnegie. right? We all know Carnegie's story. He fundamentally transformed the way we think about philanthropy, right? But he's known for this model where you spend your life accumulating wealth and then later become serious and focused about it and begin to exert all of your resources towards lifting up philanthropy, right? And Madam Walker is saying, that's not what I'm doing. I'm not waiting. I'm giving along the way, right? I'm giving you what I can right now, and yet you are rejecting it, right? You need to see me on my own terms and accept my gift and work with me rather than trying to force me into a mold for somebody else. There's another leading philanthropist of the era, a woman named Olivia Sage. She was based out of New York, and it's very interesting because given the mores of the Victorian era, she was married to a man named Russell Sage, who was a Wall Street financier. And in keeping with those moral codes, she was very restricted in what she could do outside the home. She had all these desires, but really couldn't act upon them until after he died. And she inherited millions of dollars after he died. She set up the Russell Sage Foundation and then went on a legendary philanthropic giving spree that opened up universities for women, funded the environment, helped to support some of the social sciences and the field of social work, right? But even here, Madam Walker was saying, I'm not Olivia Sage. I don't have anyone to inherit money from. Plus, I'm in the economy. I'm building a business. I'm creating the wealth I'm giving away. So please see me on my own terms and interact with me as the donor that I am. And this is very important. And I wanted to share this context. So where did Madam Walker's philanthropy come from? It came from networks of other Black women. And as I went into her story, I found that she came out of these powerful networks of generous Black women who were also giving along the way and doing what they could with what they had. I want to take you through some of these over the next few minutes and start with washerwomen. So Black washerwomen in the South were pillars of their community. This is before laundromats and all the conveniences we have today, right? But they would literally gather their clients' laundry on a Monday, gather together during the week, wash the clothes, press them, iron them, dry them, all those kinds of things, return them on Friday, and that was their business. They were menial labors. It was hard work. It was grueling work, standing over wash tubs like this one, breathing in the harsh chemicals. And yet, they weren't just menial labors. Historians have looked at Black washerwomen in the Reconstructed South and discovered that they were pillars of their community, that they were civically engaged, that they were giving to charities, that they were not only paying for their own rent and mortgages and their children's education, but they were also giving money to support Black businesses and Black schools. So they were very philanthropic in their character. And Madam Walker was very proud of having been a washerwoman, and was a part of her story that she always led off with whenever she would make public speeches, because she wanted to drive home this notion of where she came from and where she was began to engage in the community. In 1917, she told a newspaper, I was considered a good washerwoman and laundress, and I'm proud of that fact. Church women and club women, much like the washerwomen, church women, Black church women during this era were very active and engaged. They used their churches as platforms and their clubs as platforms to create schools, to speak truth to power and agitate against Jim Crow. And so when Madam Walker, or Sarah Breedlove rather, entered into St. Louis in 1889 as that young single mother who had just lost her husband and didn't really have any money, trying to find her way, she was embraced by this church here, St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. It still exists to this day in St. Louis. And when she got there, she was greeted by this social safety net created by the church and anchored by women like Jessie Batts Robinson, who became one of Sarah's lifelong friends and ended up working at the Walker Company. But Jessie was a school teacher. She was active in the church, leading its Mite Missionary Society, which was doing charity work in larger St. Louis, and also challenging the mayor and the city of St. Louis to do more to address the problems with Jim Crow. She was also active in different fraternal orders and clubs, and Sarah would have seen her engaging in these different ways. Jessie embraced Sarah, mentored her, supported her, as did other women in the church, helped get her daughter into school. And there's also evidence that Sarah began to attend a night school that St. Paul's was running. And so this was a place where she could begin to piece together a different kind of life than she had known in Delta, Louisiana, which was all funded and provided by Black philanthropy. And so in 1912, Madam Walker told a newspaper that it was in St. Louis that she learned that it was her mission to relieve the poor and distressed according as she was able. There's that gospel of giving again. Fraternal women. Madam Walker was in a fraternal order, a secret society called the Order of the Court of Philanthropy. Now, this group was dedicated to a Christian notion of charity. It was largely comprised of women, but there were some men members as well. And there were three different levels or rituals that you could rise to. Madam Walker rose through all three. And the way that you achieve those levels, you would do community service projects. They would pool their money into a fund from which social insurance and burial insurance would be provided in the community to help people during their times of need. And Jessie was a member of the Court of Philanthropy at the national level. She became the national leader of this fraternal order as well. And so it's important to understand, we might think about this as a giving circle, if you will. It's important to understand these traditions and these spaces and places where this type of generosity was being enacted and where Sarah was exposed to it and began doing it herself. Then lastly, there are the Walker women themselves. When Madam Walker stood up her company and she hired all these agents, there are reports that she had as many as 20,000 around the country. She began to organize them into clubs. And she told them that it was not enough for them to sell products, but they had to engage in charity and in the ongoing fight for racial liberation. And so there are all these reports. I was able to find at least 50 Walker clubs around the country. There are all these reports in the archive where the clubs are reporting that they raised money for the NAACP. They donated furniture to Black colleges. They participated in protests against lynching. They took this call and this charge for action seriously and engaged around the country, doing something much on the order of what we would call social entrepreneurship today. And so it's important, again, that understand these networks from washerwomen to club women and church women to fraternal women, and then to her own position of creating new networks of women for her employees. We see that these are kind of these spaces and places of generosity and activism where Sarah learned these techniques, learned these behaviors, and adapted them and then amplified them through her own company. And so that then provides a context for understanding today, because I believe, my friends, that a multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic America is now standing up and saying, much in the same way that Madam Walker said to Booker T. Washington, they're saying to fundraising and philanthropy in those professional spaces, that when it comes to the fundraising, we are unlike our dear white brothers and sisters who these fields have focused their time on. A lot of nonprofit organizations have simply ignored donors of color, right, and have not put adequate resources into engaging them and speaking to them and connecting with them in ways that resonate with their own cultures, giving and perspectives on philanthropy. And a lot of this now is coming to a head as over the past year, the call for racial and gender equity has been amplified throughout the pandemic. And organizations are now grappling with how do they become more inclusive and more engaging of a broader range of constituents. This is why in 2018, I wrote this piece for the Chronicle of Philanthropy called Donors of Color Are Not New and Emerging. They've been giving all along. Somehow the professional world of fundraising started calling donors of color new and emerging. And I wanted to challenge the field to check its language and to think about some of the historical perspectives I just offered you, saying this is not new. It might be new to organizations who don't know or who haven't engaged, but it's not new. They've been giving from the beginning of this country, and it's important to recognize that. I followed that up with a piece called 400 Years of Giving that appeared in The Conversation, again, to chronicle and tell the lives of other Black philanthropists who had given from the colonial era to as recently as 2019, to drive home this fact too, that there is this generous culture of giving. It is everywhere. It is right under your noses, even if you just don't know where to look for it. And so it's important to recognize these traditions and value them. And so that's why I offer this in the book, this model of a landscape of Black philanthropy today in the 21st century, and sharing some of the places and spaces where it is thriving and is being engaged. And so the Black church is still foundational to this practice. It is the primary philanthropic institution in the community. It's the primary place where it's still practiced on a regular basis, and it's taught generation to generation as it is across communities, right? And just like Walker was engaged in that, African Americans are very much engaged in church life. And even as American religious identity is somewhat on the decline, as fewer Americans are identifying as being religiously affiliated, African American religious identity is still holding fairly strong, though the millennial generation is flirting around with that. We may see some changes there. If we start at the 12 o'clock, and work our way around, there are still kinship and community-based forms of giving, just as there were in Madam Walker's era, where people are looking after each other, a neighbor's looking after neighbor, family member looking after family member. And this kind of this culture makes no distinction between giving to family and giving to neighbor, giving to stranger, right? Our westernized ideas and our tax policy says in order to be deductible, your gift has to be to a stranger, right? But this tradition predates the 1969 tax policy that created that charitable distinction. So it's important, again, to understand philanthropy on the community's own terms. Of course, there are high net worth individuals who are active in many different industries, and increasingly they're turning to family foundations, donor advised funds, and other spaces to fund their work and to think about their work. We all know America's going through an explosion of giving circles where Americans of all backgrounds, across races and ages and economic backgrounds, are joining giving circles and starting them. African Americans are no different. In fact, Black women in particular are drawn to this form, which makes sense in light of this history I just shared with you. Madam Walker, again, was in kind of giving circle-like networks through the Court of Philanthropy and through some of the women's clubs. There are also infrastructure and capacity building organizations. The most famous brand, or one that you would know, is the UNCF, right, dedicated to raising resources for historically Black colleges and universities. There also are identity-based networks and associations that are vocalizing the needs of communities of color within the professional spaces of philanthropy. And so groups like Blacks in Philanthropy, Native Americans in Philanthropy, and more recently, Women of Color in Fundraising and Philanthropy have all been raising critical issues towards racial and gender equity in the professional fields and spaces of philanthropy. And so this is just a snapshot of some of the things that are going. But when we can understand Madam Walker's approach to giving, I believe it helps us understand the way in which it activates today. And so, of course, I mean, people will automatically think about Oprah Winfrey as one of kind of the eminent kind of African-American philanthropists of this era. But, you know, I kind of I argue that it would be a mistake to think about Miss Winfrey as kind of a Black Carnegie or something like that, because in looking at interviews that she has given, she has attributed her philanthropy to her grandmother, who was born in Mississippi, Jim Crow, Mississippi, by the way, and who was also a club woman and a church woman and valued education and very much pooled resources and did these kinds of things that Madam Walker was not. So it's giving us a way to think more broadly about our philanthropists. But of course, Miss Winfrey is in a stratosphere all by herself, right? This is not about the elite. This is mainly about the everyday givers of this tradition, like my mother. Here I am with her at a very young age. Carolyn Cooper Freeman is First Lady of a church in Orange, New Jersey. Very generous to the core, not a millionaire by any stretch of imagination. She would joke with you and say that she's a thousandaire, but that's about it, right? But she would give you the shirt off her back if she thought you needed it and it would help you. And I grew up watching her lead committees, run scholarship committees, do things not only at my school, but in the broader community, just silently doing what she thought she was supposed to do. Didn't think about herself as a philanthropist, but definitely a representative of this tradition who deserves engagement and support just like any other donor. This group here is called SPIN. It is a giving circle based in Denver, Colorado, and SPIN stands for the Sisterhood of Philanthropists Impacting Needs. Each member gives $400 per year into a fund, and they collectively support youth and social justice issues in their community. Very active and engaged on the ground there. This group is called DAP. Denver African American Philanthropists, a men's group that is pooling resources and engaging issues on the ground in their community. In Washington, D.C., there's a group called the Young Black and Giving Back Institute, founded by a dynamite young lady named Ebony Johnson Cooper, who over 10 years ago, when our sector was going crazy over the millennials and how do we engage them, what do they like to give, she was very frustrated because she felt like she wasn't seeing representation of millennials of color in those conversations. So what did she do? She started this institute to focus in on millennials of color. She does board trainings for them and connects them with philanthropic strategies to grow their philanthropy as their careers are being established so it can grow and develop with them over time. And she does a biannual conference on philanthropy for millennials of color. This group here is the Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. They are one of the Divine Nine historic African American fraternities and sororities. And now let me say that all 9 of them have their own philanthropic traditions and their own initiatives. They're very active and engaged. I don't know if there's any AKAs online. There might be, but all of them engage. But it's important to recognize how they have this history of engagement. And in this photo, they are presenting a check to one of the historically Black colleges because they are in the middle of a $10 million campaign where they have committed to endow every single historically Black college with $100,000 endowments. And they've already paid off several of those, right? But this tradition, again, all 9 are doing these kinds of things. So again, this kind of giving is everywhere, right? It's omnipresent. It's not something that's new and emerging. And then, of course, there's activism is an important part of this tradition of giving. It's not just your money, but it's your voice and it's your body in terms of protesting and engaging in the struggle and agitating for justice for all. And so that gives us a different way of thinking about the Me Too movement. It's no accident that it's started by a Black woman, Tarana Burke, who would also represent this tradition from Madam Walker. It somehow got attributed to white actresses in Hollywood, but Tarana Burke is where it started, right? And so it speaks to this issue of gender in a racialized context, right? But it's something that will open up opportunities for all women to address these issues of sexism in our society. The 3 founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Black women, coming out of this same tradition of giving and engaging in activism for the overall struggle. And the kind of the latest version of what would have been the anti-lynching movement for Madam Walker and her peers that she engaged in. And the reason why we celebrate August as Black Philanthropy Month is because of these 3 Black women, Dr. Jacqueline Copeland, Valeda Fullwood, and Tracy Webb, who 10 years ago decided we needed to do something to raise the profile and awareness of Black philanthropy. And now it is literally a global celebration, celebrated across multiple countries. It's a huge event and a huge opportunity for organizations to connect with these traditions. And so again, this tradition, this approach is everywhere, is being engaged, and this is just a small slice and representation of that. And so one of the challenges, though, and I'll begin to close here so we can have some conversations, is though part of the challenge here is that there's some problems of engagement on behalf of the professional philanthropy and fundraising, that there are some institutional and structural barriers to engaging donors of color we need to be cognizant of. And there also are some interpersonal barriers that we need to begin working on. So I'm just going to briefly mention a few of those, and then we can go into some conversation. On the structural side, there are some larger issues that no single organization or person can tackle. It's more a collective thing that we as Americans have to figure out, because the dynamics of wealth inequality are based in public policy and they're based in history. And we have to grapple with that and figure out what we're going to do about it. By design, by intention, by public policy, right, did determine who was able to access things like the GI Bill and low rate mortgages from the federal government, what side of town you could live on, what schools, all of those things were predetermined by policy and deliberately locked African Americans and many other groups out of those opportunities and have left behind this racialized landscape that we live in. So we have to grapple with that and figure out what we're going to do about that. So that's the larger call and speaks to the role of public policy in this. A little bit closer to home, right? We have to deal with exclusion within our organizations and our structure. That donors of color report wanting to see representation in leadership and in staff, right? And want to feel like organizations are welcoming and interested in them and engaging with them. So that has to do with engaging issues of diversity on our boards and in our leadership ranks and in our staff ranks, and opening up opportunities for more people to enter into the professional world of philanthropy and fundraising in nonprofit organizations. Even closer to home, and I usually get a lot of questions about this one, I think as fundraisers, we need to rethink some of the ways in which we have done campaigns. We need to rethink the way we structure minimum amounts to establish funds, or rethink the giving levels we set up for campaigns. Because if we want to reach a broader amount of people and be more inclusive, we have to meet them where they are. And I know that's not easy. I know it's a lot of hard, tough questions we need to ask ourselves, and overcoming the inertia of doing things that have worked well in the past. But it has worked well by focusing on wealthy white donors, right, and not has fully opened up opportunities for others to participate. So we need to rethink some of those traditional practices that we've grown accustomed to. And I say that as a former fundraiser myself. And then there are myths and perceptions. There's still myths out there that people of color don't give, that they are usually helped by philanthropy, but not philanthropists themselves. We have to do away with that. And I think, it's one of the reasons I wrote this book, to help give people tangible information that they can grapple on and change the image. Our media still tends to lift up tech billionaires and others who tend to be white males, right? And so we don't see the rest of us, the rest of America. We don't see women. We don't see people of color. We don't see, different voices and faces attached to philanthropy, but it's been there throughout our history. And that's our collective heritage. So we all benefit when we change this space and can see each other as having the capacity to give, and not just one tiny slice of our society. I think we also need to break out of some of our homogeneous networks. Organizations have networks that we move in, right? If that is not leading to diverse boards or to diverse recruitment of staff or patients or students or stakeholders, we need to rethink the networks we're in. We need to start going to where these communities are and interact with them, again, on their own terms and in their context where we're likely to find them, and interact as a partner to open up opportunities for each other. And then lastly, cultural competency in philanthropy, understanding these traditions. And so again, I offer the book as one way to do that. And there's others who are writing about, again, the importance of understanding indigenous traditions of philanthropy. Edgar Villanueva has been on the scene for the past few years, really raising many of these issues from an indigenous standpoint, which allows us, again, to understand our collective American heritage of philanthropy that I think we all need to know. And so that's why I wrote this piece for the Chronicle of Philanthropy last fall, saying Black donor silence is a call to action, not a retreat. All too often, when fundraisers will reach out to their constituencies, and if they don't hear back, they move on to those who did respond. And I just want to give fundraisers pause for a moment. I think we all need to engage in institutional-wide cultural change and ask questions related to gender and race and inclusion and belonging. But there's also things we can do along the way, because at the end of the day, fundraisers determine who gets a visit and who doesn't. Who gets an invitation to an event and who doesn't, who gets a phone call and who doesn't. So I think we have the power, just in the way that we structure our days as professionals in these spaces, to say, who can I reach out today that we have not reached out to? Who's that donor that should be called but hasn't been called for whatever reason? Let's begin to build bridges and connect with people and meet them where they are, and make sure that our organizations are being very inclusive. And so I close out the book with a discussion of the campaign for the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History. And I'll just briefly say a few things about that and then close out and we can have some conversation. But as I began to study this campaign, I interviewed some of the fundraisers. I was struck that it was very representative of this tradition that I'm talking about and of the kinds of things that Madam Walker was doing. They were very intentional in being inclusive. And so they did rethink the structure of their campaigns. They did rethink the entry-level ways of giving and create more pathways for a diverse group of people to engage a campaign. And they had an overwhelming response. They were charged with raising $250 million. They ended up with over $300 million. And yes, they had Oprah Winfrey and Robert F. Smith and Bill and Melinda Gates and David Rubin. They did all the kind of the traditional capital campaign, major gift fundraising stuff that we know campaigns do. But when it came to other giving levels, they said, well, how can we really be open to people kind of on the ground? And so they created this $25 entry level to become a charter member so that you could have a stake in founding the museum. They had over 100,000 people coming in at that giving level. And then they asked themselves this question they initially asked, who could give us $25,000 to support this campaign? Well, that produced one kind of list. But then when they stepped back and they said, well, instead of $25,000 in one shot, who could give us $5,000 per year over 5 years? Well, that opened up a whole new universe of prospect that they hadn't even thought of before. And they were overwhelmed by the response at that level. By the time they opened, they had over 700 people, largely people of color, giving at that level. And now they have over 1,000 people, as they're still doing a lot of programming and support for them. And then there was a beautiful way in which they connected with volunteers. They were overrun by people who wanted to be docents. So they had to shut down the volunteer recruitment process because so many people were touched by the powerful case for support and wanted to be a part of it. And I don't know if any of you have had a chance to venture up to DC before the pandemic. I was able to take my family. It is an incredibly moving experience. And when you see these docents, many of whom the day I was there were African-American senior citizens, they're so proud. They're standing there with their shoulders tall, and they're there to guide you and to share a little bit of information. And they're also there to literally hug you and wipe your tears away when some of the exhibits get heavy. It's an incredibly moving experience, but you can just see the way they tapped into this tradition and this history in order to connect with people. And then lastly, the artifact donors came out of the woodwork to be a part of this, because if you're going to build a museum, you need stuff to showcase, right? And they were able to do it in such a way that encouraged thousands of people to literally go underneath the bed, into the back of the closet, into the attic, and pull out heirlooms that had been handed down generation to generation, literally things that came from their ancestors who were enslaved or who suffered under Jim Crow. They turned over to this very institution because they were very intentional in the outreach, and they saw it as a relevant thing that was speaking to them, and a place that was welcoming to them, and a place to harbor their history. And so I think there's lots we can learn from this, and making our philanthropy and our fundraising more inclusive. And so I leave with you again this idea that Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving is an accessible way of giving that I think speaks to all of us, regardless of race or gender or how much is in our bank account. Because at the end of the day, Madam Walker's approach to philanthropy says this, that philanthropy does not come from wealth. It comes from generosity, right? And any one of us can be generous. You don't have to wait. You don't have to wait until you have more time or more money. Rather, as you acquire more time, give more time. As you acquire more money, give more money. As you acquire more influence, open more doors and be helpful to more people, right? Because we can all give right now. We don't have to wait. And so I hope Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving inspires and grounds people in our collective American history and gives us ways of thinking about how to be more inclusive as a field moving forward. Thank you very much. Look forward to conversations with you. Invite you to visit my website, gospelofgiving.com. And please connect with me on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. What an amazing program. We're going to open it up to questions now. If y'all have a question for Dr. Freeman, put it in the chat, and I will relay those to him. We have had several people say that they have been to the African American or the American Museum of African American History, and Lisa Davis is a member. I'm not sure if one of the founding members, but
awesome, wonderful.
Oh yeah. All right, well, while we wait for people to put any questions in the chat, we did have some come in through email ahead of time, so I'll go ahead and ask those. This is from, I'm gonna mess up this name. She's got in parentheses here, Dr. A. So this is from Dr. A. And she asks, what 1 to 2 foundational principles should new philanthropic funds consider when determining focus areas or community investments to support?
Well, I would say I think the larger pandemic, right, is challenging us to think about these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. So I would say, think one, trying how can you be equitable in how you distribute those and get the resources to organizations that are dealing with the issues most important to the group that that is deciding how to use the funds, and are they doing that work in a way that is inclusive and that honors the agency of the communities being served, rather than that does things for them or to them, but really does things with them in partnership, and really thinks about also how can you as donors leverage additional support. I really think that this is a time for some of the donors, particularly the donors who are new to racial equity, to kind of step back a little bit. Thank you for your donation. I think keep giving. I think that's important, but I think it's important to honor these organizations and respect these organizations and let them take the lead. I think it'll be important for these donors to also lend their activism and their political influence, because a lot of the issues that need to be addressed have this important political dimension. And so if there's going to be changes in police relations, then police unions have to be engaged. And that's difficult work. If there's going to be changes in school systems, the teacher unions have to be engaged, right? City councils have to be engaged. State legislatures, Washington, D.C. have to be engaged. So how can you support your financial investments and financial gifts with using other forms of influence to advance public policy initiatives that support those same issues? I think that's kind of a next level where we need to get the resources to these organizations doing the work on the ground in the communities, but there also needs to be more public support at the public policy level to begin to reverse some of the public policy aspects of these issues that go along with it.
Sure. We've two questions coming through the chat. The first one from Lisa. She says, so one can consider themselves a philanthropist based on their giving. I assume she means at any level.
Yes, yes. This tradition doesn't limit it to a bank account or to money. In fact, my book is organized by chapters named for the different kinds of gifts that Madam Walker made, and only one is about money. That chapter is at the back of the book, because I really wanted to highlight this idea that back then, again, they weren't limited, but they weren't thinking in terms of tax policy. They were thinking about, this Jim Crow thing is evil, and it is affecting every aspect of life. So,
in terms of representation, representation is important across not only the education, but of course also across in the employment field. And my son got into Harvard, but he got into Harvard.
Does somebody need to mute or
his 4.0 GPA?
I can't.
And that's about
I can't tell if she's commenting on ours or not. Hold on a second. See, I can.
Okay, it's going. It's really Jim Crow affected you from the time you woke up to the time you went to bed. It wasn't limited to one area. And so this is why Madam Walker thought of her business as a vehicle for liberation. And so she used it very much as a vehicle to do a lot of this work. And so she was doing many of the same things that Black women were typically doing through their clubs or their churches, but she did it through the company. So it really is this kind of all hands on deck approach. Use whatever resource you have that could be helpful to someone else. And the other thing that I would say here is that she was operating at both levels. Today, we kind of think about this notion of charity as doing something for an individual who might be struggling. And then we like to think about having a broader sense of philanthropy as something more strategic or systematic. She wasn't really making those kind of distinctions, but she was working in both arenas. She would give to neighbors. She would give food out on Christmas and Thanksgiving. She would buy wheelchairs for people who had disabilities and doing all these things for one-on-one for people. But she also was in networks that were, speaking truth to power about Jim Crow. She was funding the NAACP to try to get anti-lynching public policy passed, right? So she was doing both and I think that's what we're dealing with. Certainly the pandemic has shown us the importance of both and, because day-to-day survival required a lot of mutual aid as people started looking after family members and neighbors and all of this coverage of media coverage of mutual aid approaches that got more attention because there were government failures to begin with and it wasn't clear what was happening, right? And so it was important. It was all hands on deck, do what you can. So that's very much the definition of philanthropy that I'm putting forward in this book and challenging our field on, because I think we have limited ourselves when we only think about philanthropy from the standpoint of a Carnegie or a Winfrey or a Gates. That's one part of it. You can create an area where you can look at what the elite do. That's fine. All I'm saying is that's not all it is. It's a human phenomenon. It's not a wealthy phenomenon. And it's something that belongs across cultures and across communities and something that we can all engage. And so I think that Walker's model of gospel of giving, which I articulate 3 principles for, is something that all of us can connect to and begin doing, again, regardless of what we have, because it's not about wealth, it's just about generosity.
Wow. I'm so glad to hear this on so many levels, but we, several of us on here work for the Women's Philanthropy Board at Auburn University. And that's one of our founding principles, is that you don't have to give just your treasure. Your time and your talent and your trust also are considered methods of philanthropy, and starting that at a very young age.
Yes.
Even little, kids, given a couple of dollars, it still, it counts.
Absolutely.
Moving on to the next question. This one is lengthy, but I'm going to read the whole thing.
Okay.
This is from Emily. When you talked about the problems of engagement for African Americans, the problems with representation and leadership in staff stuck out to me. In social psychology, we've talked about attitudes and biases when hiring for jobs. I was wondering if you had ways in mind to prevent these biases and the inequality that you discussed, and if there are things that can be initiated in application processes to further diversity, leadership, and staff positions.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, well, one, I think it starts with being reflective practitioners and reflective leaders in organizations, and really kind of taking the pulse of where you are. What is the status of diversity, equity, inclusion in your organization? And there are a lot of instruments out there and groups that are doing that in higher education. I know CASE just released an excellent book on this issue done by my friend, Dr. Angelique Grant from Aspen. So there's lots of tools out there for doing that, but it's important to then, kind of get the sense of, take your own pulse, and then, be very intentional. It's important to, again, go where you can find the pool, and not just say that, we tried, but we couldn't really find anyone. One of the things I like to point out for people is that there's a group called the African American Development Officers Network, based out of Atlanta, Georgia, run by my friend Birgit Smith Burton. And she has a database of over 3,000 African American and Hispanic fundraisers from all types of organizations, from local neighborhood-based organizations to some of the top largest nonprofits in the world. And so they are out there. It just takes an intentional strategy and desire to connect and to go to where they are. And they may not see it in just the Chronicle alone, but she has this process where she will promote positions, and she does a conference in partnership with CASE and others. There are other groups that have emerged on the scene during the pandemic: Woke, Women of Color in Fundraising and Philanthropy, which has over 1,000 members now. It started during the pandemic, right? But speaking to the unique needs of women in this field, right? So I think all these things are communicating to us that that people want to be able to be themselves in their role, and so we have to tailor our practices, our organizational cultures to that, and make space for that, and not only just kind of welcome them in, but we have to kind of rethink the way we do things. I say it's not enough to invite people to our table. Once they're there, we have to be willing to fundamentally restructure the table, because the table has been based on our preferences and the way that we do things. And those are the kinds of things that have created this problem in inclusion to begin with. So I would definitely consult those kinds of resources in thinking about recruitment strategies and others. And then I think it's important to think about, if we talk about fundraisers, I'm encouraged. I know I'm talking to some folks at the University of Cincinnati. They actually are including their advancement operation in their campus diversity audit. So they are looking at whether or not their fundraisers are engaging their alumni of color and their donors of color on their visits. They're reviewing contact reports and event attendance, because they want to get a baseline and they want to get better. So I think that's how we need to think. We need to question everything that we've done before and just see what are opportunities to begin opening up and becoming more inclusive for others.
We've had a request for you to list your media handles and social media handles.
Oh, okay. Sure.
And I've got a couple more questions from Dr. A. She asks, in what ways are foundations or philanthropic entities engaging meaningfully with the community or their communities in this current environment that's not conducive to conventional gatherings?
So just kind of, pandemic convenings, is that what the question is?
I think that's what she means. I think so.
Yeah. I think, I would imagine that a lot of these things have moved and shifted online. I will say that there's some important networks of funders whose work has definitely continued online. One of those is ABFE, the Association of Black Foundation Executives. And in fact, their conference is coming up next month. And they have been out front advocating for a focus on the agency in the community, a focus on honoring the organizations and resourcing over a longer period of time, reducing the number of strings attached to grants, even funding activism. They've highlighted some examples where foundations have funded activists and allowed them to do retreats and planning and other things to promote, their public policy strategy for making some of these systems changes. So I think some of those things are important, but I would not, be able to point you in the direction of some specific convenings other than those kinds of examples that I know about.
Okay. And last question, I think.
Okay.
What intentional strategies are you seeing philanthropic institutions implement to address inequalities that exist internally, people, processes, systems? You kind of answered this before, but do you have anything to add?
Well, there have long been calls, if we look at the foundation side, there have long been calls for foundations to diversify their boards, to have more representation from the actual communities being invested in, and to take a look at how equitably those dollars are being distributed, to tear down some of the walls and the networks that can be difficult for some organizations to get into, or to kind of prove themselves to be worthy of investment. It can be difficult to kind of get through all those. So there's calls for that. There are calls for extending the timeline of grants and to not do kind of 1-year cycles, but to think 10-year cycles, even 20-year cycles, to really kind of flip the way we do it and to ways that honor the agency of organizations, and continually invest and resource them. And so those are a couple of things I would highlight, but I would say, again, good sources for that would be, again, ADFI has a whole strategy. They call this the Campaign for Black-Led Social Change. They have 10 principles to support communities from a grant-making perspective that's available on their website. And of course, Edgar Villanueva's book, this whole idea of decolonizing wealth. He lays out, again, beautifully within the context of indigenous culture, ways to think about this and being more open. There are a lot of voices on the scene who are doing that kind of work.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you again, everyone, for being here, and especially Dr. Freeman for sharing your time and your expertise with us. This was absolutely fascinating. If anyone would like to purchase the book, we've got links that we can send you. If you registered early enough, you will have received those links when you registered, but please let us know if you would like that. And if you missed a part of this presentation or would like to share it with other people, we'll have this entire event up on our Carey Center YouTube page. So please feel free to share it, go back and watch it in its entirety. And we just really appreciate everybody being here today. And thank you so much again, Dr. Freeman. This was really wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.